Hello, this is Todd Lewis, the host of the Praise of Folly podcast. Here I'm joined with Keith Preston from Attack the System, and we're here to discuss tonight US Imperialism. Now, Keith, I have a question for you. When the United States, one of the reasons why we seceded from the British Empire was Britain had passed a law that prevented westward expansion to protect Indian territory. And I find it interesting that was one of the reasons why we had a bone to pick with Britain.
Well, that's absolutely right. The conventional narrative, of course, that we get from everywhere, the educational system, the mass media, and the majority of textbooks written on this subject even today, is that the reason for the Revolutionary War of 1776, or at least it began in 1775, is that the colonists were being oppressed by the British, and that the British were making them pay taxes and imposing import tariffs on tea and stamps and things like that, and making the colonists quarter troops unjustly. So the colonists decided they weren't going to stand for it and staged a revolt and seceded from the British Empire. There's actually a lot more to it than that. One of the issues was the one that you mentioned, that the colonists were very big on Western expansion on the grounds that there was a lot of land and resources out there ripe for the taking, except for this problem of the fact that it was already occupied by the American Indian nations. But the colonists continued to try to expand westward, and of course the Indian nations were not happy about this, and they would retaliate by attacking the colonists as they continued their westward expansion. It was actually, if we want to use a modern analogy, it was somewhat similar to what happens in Israel with the settlements, where you have these Israeli settlements that keep trying to expand into the Palestinian territories, and then the Palestinians retaliate against them, and then Israel comes in and retaliates against the Palestinians. That's an issue there even today, and it was a somewhat similar situation when the colonists kept expanding into the Native American or American Indian territories, and the British were opposed to this. The British believed it to be unnecessarily inflammatory. It was creating conflict between the colonists and the native peoples. The British did not want to expand a lot of troops and resources trying to protect the colonists when they were doing this. So the British were opposed to this expansion. And one of the grievances that the colonists had against the British when they seceded, and this is actually in the Declaration of Independence, where they talk about how the British have not done their part to protect the colonists during their from Indian attacks during their expansionist efforts. And their take on it was, well, we're British citizens, we're the colonies, are part of the British under the rule of the Crown, and therefore it's the responsibility of the Crown to help the colonists expand westward, and the British weren't particularly happy with this. A related issue, too, that I think influenced the secession by the colonies initially was the fact that England was moving towards the banning of slavery, that in the early 1700s, slavery had actually been declared illegal at common law in a landmark British court decision. And for that reason, I think a lot of the slave interest in the colonies saw the writing on the wall when it came to that as well. So they wanted to get out of town quickly before that impacted their own interest.
Wasn't there a law where it said that any slave that set foot on the British Isles was a free man for the rest of his life?
I don't know of the specific details of that. I do know that it was during the early 1700s. I think in 1771, 1772, there was a landmark case in England where slavery was actually declared illegal by common law. I can't remember the name of the jurist who decided that case. I want to say it was Lord Halifax, but I may be wrong about that. But there was a landmark case. It was similar to, say, a landmark Supreme Court decision in the United States, like Brown versus the Board of Education or something like that, where it was actually ruled that slavery, according to British common law tradition, was incompatible with common law principles, that you can't own another person. It's basically amounts to theft of a person, kidnapping. When that was in the just a few years before the secession happened, and it was true that England moved a lot quicker to eliminate slavery than the British colonies did in the Western Hemisphere, and I think that played a role in the secession. I've discussed this with English people before, English libertarians and others. Because I'm always interested in what the British take on the American Revolution was, and that's one of the arguments that they'll use. They'll say, "Well, the problem with you Americans is you just wanted to keep your slaves, and you wanted all of this military assistance for your westward expansion. You didn't want to pay any taxes to cover it," and that's their take.
Yeah, well, one of the interesting things is you mentioned earlier that there's this kind of like propaganda narrative we get from the government about plucky young revolutionaries trying to fight for freedom from taxes. In a lot of ways, even libertarians buy into that. Murray Rothbard was certainly captivated by that narrative of tax revolt and rejection of the British authority. And, what you mentioned with slavery, throughout the entire empire, Britain outlawed slavery by 1833. But this might be a little too far off topic, but the outlawing of slavery actually created a new pretext for imperialism, because Britain and Africa would use the pretext of abolishing slavery to invade other countries to end slavery.
Well, yeah, that's the tradition of liberal imperialism, and the European imperial empires always use that as a pretext for colonial expansion. We're not conquering these people, we're civilizing them. These people are savages, they're barbarians, and we're civilizing them. And that's nothing that was unique to the European colonial empires. Even in ancient times, Alexander the Great would say the same thing. We're bringing the advancements of Hellenic civilization to all of these barbarian people. The Romans made the same argument. And that's always been true of imperialist systems. The Japanese in World War II, Imperial Japan, they would more or less claim that they were liberating Asia from Western imperialism. So that's a standard rationalization behind imperialism. But it's true, though, that the British developed an interesting form of imperialism that was supposedly rooted in liberal principles, and the idea of the white man's burden. It's the idea of that we are a civilized people. We're going to go out and civilize all of these other folks who were backward barbarians. And once slavery was abolished in Britain and throughout the empire, that became a rationale for it. It's no different than when someone like Christopher Hitchens said that we're going to go to war in Afghanistan and bomb them out of the Stone Age and things like that. It's just an earlier precedent for that kind of thinking.
So wait, bomb them out of the Stone Age. Curtis LeMay said bomb them back to the Stone Age. But one of the other things as far as seeds of U.S. imperialism was the empire of liberty that Madison and Jefferson went on and on about. Why don't you explain that a little bit for our listeners?
Yeah, Jefferson had this idea of westward expansion for the purpose of creating what he called an empire of liberty. That's actually in one of his speeches or writings. It may have been in one of his presidential speeches. But Jefferson was, of course, instrumental in the Louisiana Purchase, the acquisition of the Louisiana Purchase. In fact, he always said that's one of the things that he was most proud of in terms of all of his accomplishments in his career. Even more so than having been president of the United States, I believe. He was, there were three things he always said he was the most proud of. I think it was the Louisiana Purchase, having authored the Declaration of Independence, and I think the other one was having founded the University of Virginia. But he was very big on westward expansion, and that was one of the reasons he was so big on the Louisiana Purchase, is because it provided all of this land for the Americans to colonize and settle on. And he had this idea that the North America would eventually be this empire of liberty, in the sense that it would be this continent-wide empire based on what he thought of as classical liberal and Enlightenment principles. In some ways, it was sort of a predecessor or a less extreme version of something like the Napoleonic Wars. The Napoleonic Wars were rooted in a similar set of ideas, that we're spreading the French Revolution and these Enlightenment classical liberal ideas that it's based on throughout the European continent. And that's really something that the Americans were doing in the northern North America, in the Western Hemisphere, even before the French.
Yeah. I don't know about you, but I think maybe one of the roots of U.S. imperialism is a kind of extension of the New England Puritan notion of a city on a hill. There were New England Puritans that viewed the Native Americans as Canaanites. They were the new Israel, and this was the promised land. And even after America ceased being a Christian country, this kind of city on a hill became this secular liberal Puritanism. And it kind of drove us westward and then to global hegemony.
Yeah, I think that that's one particular strand that influenced the development of American imperialism. The idea that the Puritans had, they were very sectarian, and they had this idea that they were essentially creating a type of new Israel in New England, it's sort of their version of the land of Canaan or the Promised Land or something like that. And they did regard the Native American people as the equivalent of, say, the Amalekites or the Canaanites, some of the bad guys from the Old Testament. So that in turn led to this kind of thinking, I believe, that this kind of utopian thinking that the North America was some new unsettled land that was ripe for the taking, and the folks that were already there didn't matter. They were just barbarian savages, barely above animals in the view that the Europeans had of them. Now, I don't think that the Puritan legacy is the only thing that influenced this kind of thinking. I think that the Enlightenment view of progress, the idea that the Enlightenment sort of became a rationalization for European chauvinism in a way, in the sense that they developed the idea that, well, we're better than everyone else because we've achieved all of this enlightenment and this high culture and civilization, so we can go out and conquer all of these other peoples. And they did that in North America and Africa and Asia and elsewhere. And all of these things kind of converge to make American imperialism what it is. It's this kind of empire of liberty idea you get from Jeffersonian liberalism. It's the Enlightenment idea of progress. It's the Puritan idea of a shining city on a hill. It's also capitalism, this idea that, wow, this continent out here, this unexplored massive continent with all of these this abundance of natural resources and wildlife, it's all there for the taking, and the only thing that's in the way are these Stone Age Native American people, so let's just get rid of them and everything will be fine. And look what we'll have. And I think that all of those things really are what fed into Manifest Destiny as it developed during the 19th century.
Yeah, the Native Americans, of course, were the I guess you could say the first victims of U.S. imperialism. One of the interesting problems we see with Indian American settler relations is a fundamentally different concept of ownership. Many Native Americans were nomadic, and so they wouldn't live in the same area for any great length of time because they'd hunt all the game, or the seasons would shift and the game would be unavailable. And so they'd hunt in a region in the summer, then they'd move during the winter and then come back in the next summer. And that mode of ownership was utterly foreign to Europeans, who believed that you'd buy a land, you'd settle there, you'd build a house, you'd farm, you'd live there the year round. And I wonder how much of the friction was the result of a kind of confusion based on incompatible property systems.
Well, you have throughout history different ideas of what constitutes ownership and what constitutes access to resources in different kinds of cultures and societies. One long-standing debate that I have with a lot of orthodox libertarian types is over the way that they deify this concept of property rights. And what I tend to believe is that property rights are, to use a good leftist term, are socially constructed, in the sense that they evolve out of particular cultural and material conditions and social conditions. And in traditional African societies, for example, they didn't really have a concept of land ownership. They did have a concept of person ownership, the idea of having slaves that you own. So in some of the traditional African societies, if you were a rich person, you owned lots of slaves. The idea of owning land in some of those cultures would have been unthinkable. It would be like owning the air is to us. Like we don't look in the newspaper for real estate for sale and see people trying to sell air, but that would have the Africans would have thought the same about ownership of land, and the Native Americans had a similar view. They didn't really think of land ownership per se as much as, I mean, they had systems of demarking territory. It wasn't completely a free-for-all, or no man's land, or however you want to describe it. But the Europeans were much more settled on this idea of you have your property and land, and it was rooted in the feudal idea of the landed estates and things like that. And which in turn went back to Roman times and Roman ideas about land ownership and family dynasties and royalty and all of that. So the Native Americans tended to, they were somewhat nomadic people, many of them were, and they would settle in different places at times, but they might migrate much more frequently. And because of that, I do think a lot of the Europeans at the time had the idea, well, nobody really owns any of these lands. You just have these nomadic people that just kind of seem to drift around a bit. And I think that in their own mind was used to justify colonial conquest.
In some ways, it kind of reminds me of an animal's hunting range. Like a wolf pack will have a range that it hunts, and any other wolf pack that enters into it will be seen as an intruder, and they'll try to chase them off. But they don't live in any one place for too long. They just use the whole range to hunt. And another thing is their westward expansion. It's kind of interesting because on the one hand, you had a lot of spontaneous entrepreneurs, if you will, that went out west, fur trappers, miners, homesteaders. And it's the whole Indian relations issue is rather complicated because a lot of times trappers would marry Indian squaws. There'd be friendly relationships, there'd be hostile relationships. Sometimes the Indians would be provocative. Sometimes the settlers would be provocative. It seems to me that a lot of the bad blood was a result of the U.S. government breaking treaties. The U.S. government repeatedly broke Indian treaties that, an individual, if I sign a treaty with an Indian tribe, I just can't break it because I'm an individual. If I break it, the whole tribe will come down on top of me and wipe me out. And I think of the westward expansion as like two thrusts. There's a kind of spontaneous entrepreneurial thrust of farmers, homesteaders, prospectors, and trappers, which got along moderately well with the Indians. And then there was the kind of government conquest where like a railroad might say, ask for government help to build railroad tracks. And if it went through Indian land, they'd call in the U.S. Army to wipe them out. So I feel like it's kind of a complicated top-down, bottom-up kind of thing. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. As far as the relationships that European settlers had with different Native American groups, it spanned the whole spectrum. Sometimes they had friendly relations, they had intermarriage, sometimes they had intercultural fighting. I think, though, that the real issue, like you were saying, is that the United States government itself was bent on territorial expansion and eventual conquest of all of these Western lands. And I think that's the things that you pointed out really summarize what happened very well. One example you mentioned was the railroads. And in fact, I remember having an argument once, well, not an argument, but just a discussion with a libertarian once who was talking about all of the great, railroad entrepreneurs of the 19th century and how they were representations of capitalism at its finest. And I'm like, yeah, where did they get their land? They got their land through government conquest. Where did they get the capital to build these railroads? They got it from the government banks. So yeah, the real issue, I think, is that the American government always, right from the start, had this idea of westward expansion and eventual conquest of the Native American territories to the west, and not just in North America. If you go back and read the writings of early American leaders, and including the well-known ones, like Jefferson and George Washington and people like that, you see reference to their ideas about expansion into the Caribbean and into Central America and things like that as well. So this was always a common idea that ran through the United States political elite right from the start. One famous doctrine that came out of foreign policy concept that came out of the early America was the Monroe Doctrine, named after President James Monroe. And James Monroe was basically saying, well, the Western Hemisphere is rightfully the sphere of influence of the United States, and these Europeans need to stay out of it. And what he meant by that was, well, we want all of this for ourselves. We want to dominate the entirety of the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, and so the British, the French, the Spanish need to stay away. It's really essentially it's the same position that Vladimir Putin takes with Central Asia today. That this is rightfully a Russian sphere of influence, and the Westerners need to stay out. So it's rather ironic when you see so much Putin bashing now, because he's essentially formulating a Monroe Doctrine for Russia.
Well, exactly. I think one of the watersheds of U.S. imperialism that set a kind of standard was the Mexican War. Because in the Mexican War, James K. Polk sent American troops into disputed land and kind of provoked the skirmish. And after some Americans were shot, he said, "Americans died on American land." And that really fired up the base. And it's not really a false flag, but it's a kind of contrived event. And we see this over and over and over again. Abraham Lincoln in 1861 with Fort Sumter. And in fact, I think the head of Fort Sumter was about to surrender until Lincoln gave a supply of reinforcements, food, guns, soldiers, which said, "Oh, I don't need to surrender now. I'll just keep on fighting," which made the South fire the first shot. And then, of course, Pearl Harbor, where the United States provoked Japan to fire the first shot. So this idea of causing the enemy to fire the first shot to then play the victim card, I think we see starting with Mexico. And it's been a very effective strategy since then.
Yeah, well, that strategy was used in many other places as well, including situations that aren't very well known. That's largely what led to the invasion of the Philippines by the United States under President McKinley. A few years earlier, there had been an invasion of Hawaii. The Mexican War, I think you're right. It really does sort of set the standard for that, or set the stage for that. In the 1850s, the United States invaded Mexico and took a third of their country from them. In fact, Texas, of course, was once an independent nation as well, and that was eventually annexed by the United States. But even with the South, the Southern Civil War is interesting because I think that can be interpreted in certain ways that normally aren't recognized. I tend to see the conflict between the North and the South as essentially a continuation of the European conflict between the traditional aristocracy and the church and the monarchy on one hand, and the traditional European system, versus the rise of the classical liberalism as an intellectual movement and the bourgeoisie as a class. I think you can look at, and also between agrarian societies and between industrial societies, I think you can look at the conflict between the North and the South, and you can see that the South was much more closely resembled a traditional European society. And certainly it was an agricultural society. It was a more static society. It was a more hierarchical society.
More feudal?
Yeah, it was much more feudal in nature. And the North is where capitalism really began in the United States. It was more of a capitalist industrial society. It had abolished slavery and was reliant on wage labor. And I think you can really interpret the war between the North and the South as a sort of a class conflict between feudalism and capitalism. When I was in college, when I was in graduate school, I had a class on the Civil War. I actually wrote a paper defending this particular point of view. And my professor, who was a Berkeley graduate, he went to Berkeley during the 60s. So you can imagine what he thought of this argument. But I think it's a defensible position. I've discussed it with some of the Southern nationalist people that I know, and a lot of them actually think there's something to this. I'm not someone who thinks that the antebellum South was some kind of idyllic society. I think that Southern slavery was a terrible thing, and it's also, we have to consider the role of the South and the westward expansion that led to the Trail of Tears as well. So I don't really share this view that the South, the antebellum South, this idyllic society of all these patrician gentlemen and their, who lorded it paternalistically over their slaves, and like
Didn't the
kids.
South also bait for the Mexican War?
Well, I don't know a lot about that, but I'll put it this way: the South never really expressed particularly a great deal of objection to westward expansion. It was one of the issues that, of course, that led to the Civil War was as westward expansion was taking place, one of the big issues was whether slavery would be allowed in the Western territories. That was one of the issues that led to the Civil War. And of course, the South wanted to expand the Southern plantation system into the West. And the North were like, no, we're not going to expand that system into the West at all. Now, it's important to understand, too, that a lot of the North's objections to Southern slavery were not based on humanitarian regard for the condition of the slaves. There were a lot of racists in the North who didn't want blacks in the United States at all, period, slave or free. And for that reason...
Didn't Lincoln want to deport the blacks back to Africa?
Yeah, that was his idea. They had this concept called colonization. And you actually had this group called the American Colonization Society. And the idea was that the black slaves should be repatriated to Africa. And in fact, they made efforts along those lines. The country of Liberia that exists today in West Africa, that's what that was. That was an effort by the Americans to repatriate a lot of American blacks back to Africa.
Shouldn't Lincoln be a white nationalist hero then?
Well, I remember years ago seeing some literature put out by the American Nazi Party or a group like that, where they had all these quotes from Lincoln about, the black man and white man are not fit to live together, and the blacks should be repatriated to Africa. And they were saying, see, Honest Abe was one of us. Yeah, I mean, well, we have to consider that in 19th century America, racism of that kind was virulent. I mean, the idea that, even the most conservative people that you find today in the United States, as far as their views on race, would be liberal by the standards of that time period. I mean, maybe a group like the American Nazi Party or something wouldn't be, but other than that, the view that was the view of race that existed back then in the United States and in the Western world generally was that there was this hierarchy of within the human species, and that the Europeans were the most advanced human species, and the Asians were second, and the Africans were third, and the Native Americans were fourth. Even some of the greatest thinkers from the Enlightenment and from the early modernity had views on race that to a modern liberal sensibilities would be shocking. I believe John Locke actually speculated that black Africans had emerged as a result of sexual relations between humans and apes or something like that. It was they used to have this term for Africans. They called them drills, I believe. They were considered these. They considered them to be this kind of half human, half ape hybrid. I mean, that's how they perceived of them. The racism in the United States in the 19th century was way off the charts by contemporary standards.
Yeah, you mentioned the idea that the Civil War was a class war. One of the proponents of that was J.F.C. Fuller. Now, he was on the side of the North, but he argued that it was a class war between capitalists and agrarian slave owners, and that it was more of an economic dispute than anything else.
Since you mentioned that was the Marxist position as well. That's actually what Marx and Engels believed. Marx and Engels wrote about the Civil War, American Civil War, because it happened during their lifetime. Marx was actually a reporter for the journal, the British press, when that was going on, when the American Civil War was going on. And Marx was very pro-union because
that should tell you something.
Yeah, he viewed it as a class war between capitalism and feudalism, and Marx and Engels viewed the Mexican War the same way. They viewed that as a wonderful thing. They thought, the advanced Americans have taken and seized this territory from this reactionary Mexican society. Keep in mind, of course, that a lot of Central and South America during that time period had been Spanish colonies, and the the Marxists, of course, despised the Spanish as reactionary feudalists, and they viewed the Americans and the British as being progressive forces. In fact, they actually thought the Marxist revolution, the communist revolution, would happen first in America and England because those were the most advanced industrial societies. So they were always very supportive of the Marxists. The early Marxists were always very supportive of imperialism, of American imperialism and British imperialism in particular. Leftist anti-imperialism, well, Marxist anti-imperialism really starts with Lenin. He was really one of the early theoreticians of anti-imperialism that gave it a Marxist slant. Now there had been leftist anti-imperialism before that, like the anarchists. The anarchists had taken a strong anti-imperialist line on various things. But Marxists were always pro-imperialist up until about the time of the Russian Revolution.
Yeah, well, I think the Civil War is kind of a watershed for a couple of reasons. In The American Way of War by Russell F. Weegley, he argues that Indian policy prior to the Civil War was one of relocation. After the Civil War, the Indian policy was one of extermination. And he lists some quotes from Grant and Sherman talking about exterminating the Native Americans. And of course, the strategies that Sherman would use in the Red River Campaign of, I think it was 1877, and the tactics used by the Union Army out against the Indians were first perfected in the American Civil War against the South. Places like Georgia, the Shenandoah in Virginia. And in many ways, the liberal or anarchist or socialist or Marxist critique of U.S. Imperialism against the Indians, especially in the latter half of the 19th century, I think rings kind of hollow, because the tactics, the strategies, the cruelty used against the Sioux and the Cheyenne and the Comanche were first perfected against Americans, like in the South, like in Georgia and in Virginia. And by perfecting it in the Civil War, Grant and Sherman ripped up railroads. They shot cattle and stock so people would starve the next year because there was no food. This whole idea of like starving somebody out by shooting all their stock wasn't perfected against the Sioux. It was perfected against American citizens, or formerly American citizens. And I feel like a consistent anti-imperialist narrative would point that out.
Well, I've had that discussion with people on the left over the years. I've often taken a lot of flack over the years from people on the left for being relatively sympathetic to causes like Southern nationalism and things like that. And I'll always say, well, the Civil War was really the dress rehearsal for American imperialism. I mean, it really was, as you said, it's how they perfected it. It was sort of a dress rehearsal for the tactics that were later used against the Native American nations in the West and other places, and in the Philippines and in the Pacific and Latin America. And it was also another thing that needs to be pointed out is that and you alluded to this somewhat as well, is that it was in the Civil War between the North and the South that the Americans really started to develop the modern concept of a total war. If you follow fourth generation warfare theory, that's a little off the subject, but one of the insights of fourth generation warfare theory is that it was around the time of the Civil War that war began to take on the dimension where it included civilian populations as actual targets of war. The earlier model of war was that war was almost like a sport. It was like in the sense that there were certain rules, there were certain standards of conduct. I mean, it was still bloody. People still died, of course, but it was also the idea that there are some limits to the extremes that you can use in war. And one of the limits was you don't target civilian populations. You try to keep women and children out of it, and things like that. This kind of gentlemanly approach to war. And it was really the North during the Civil War that started to throw these kinds of ideas overboard and wage war in the sense of a war is something between societies. It's not just between armies, it's between societies. And the idea that anything goes as long as you win. The scorched earth policies that you saw in the Civil War that they meant that were used in places like Atlanta and then Savannah, Georgia, I believe, and places like that. That really is the beginning of the modern concept of a total war that led to the kind of stuff we saw in World War II, for example, like the bombing campaigns in Dresden and Hamburg, or the firebombing of Tokyo, or nuking Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Of course,
Exactly.
it wasn't just the Allies that did that. I mean, the Axis powers did that kind of stuff as well, um, often with not as great an efficiency, but they use those kinds of tactics also. But yeah, the American Civil War really is a prelude to the kind of total war we saw in the 20th century.
Yeah, the difference between General Sherman and Henry Hap Arnold was one of technology and not much else. One of the things is with the South being, as we both agree, a dress rehearsal for future U.S. imperialism. This sort of liberal sympathy with Native Americans, I find to be odd, because the Native Americans could be just as cruel and inhuman as the Americans. I mean, they had slavery, they had ritualized torture. I mean, the Aztecs had human sacrifice. I mean, I think if you were to have a Comanche warrior from 1870 and a Southern gentleman from 1870 and compare them to a modern liberal, the modern liberal would agree with the Southern gentleman more than the Comanche warrior.
Yeah, there's probably a great deal of truth to that. The Native American people were extremely diverse. There were a lot of different nations or tribes or clans within that, and some of them were relatively peaceful. Some of them were very warlike. It's the same with different nations around the world. One thing that's interesting is that in the time of the European settlement, and then later the American independence, and then later the Civil War, you also always found a lot of division among the American Indian nations about how to deal with the Europeans. During the American Revolution, for example, there were some Native Americans that fought on the side of the colonists. There were others that fought on the side of the British. During the Civil War, it was the same way. You actually had 5 independent Native American nations that formed an alliance with the Confederacy. The Cherokee were the largest one, and there were others, and then there were also others that were on the side of the Union. And it was always like that. The idea that the Native Americans had this kind of unified front against the Europeans is non-historical. There was always a great deal. In fact, that's one of the reasons why they were eventually conquered as extensively as they were, is because of the divisions like that within their own ranks. As far as the cultural and social practices you found among them, yeah, they had slavery in some of their communities. In fact, during the Trail of Tears, when the Cherokee were being and some others nations were being forcibly relocated out of the southern region of the United States, some of the people that were actually forcibly relocated were actually slaves, were actually black slaves that were owned by Native Americans. So yeah, I mean, there's plenty of blood on everyone's hands.
It's complicated.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things about the Native American component of U.S. imperialism, now this is not directly related to the U.S., but sheds some light on it. The historian Matthew Restall in 2003 published a book called 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest. And one of the myths that he debunks is the myth of native solidarity. You see, there was in the rational self-interest of Native Americans, of some tribes, to ally with Europeans. For instance, in Mexico, the Tlaxcala, who were oppressed by the Aztecs, allied with Cortez. And it was in their rational self-interest to do so. And in Peru, Atahualpa had just won a civil war against his brother. His brother's forces continued to resist, and they allied with the Spanish under Pizarro. And in the United States, the Pawnee tribe became scouts for the U.S. Army against the Sioux. And so the weaker tribes, vis-a-vis the more powerful tribes, would see the Europeans or the United States as potential allies in their unequal struggle against the Aztecs or the Sioux.
Yeah, well, the native peoples of the Western Hemisphere don't really represent a single culture or a single nation. There was a huge amount of diversity between them, and they frequently fought with each other in the same way that the Europeans did. I mean, the European history is littered with ethnic and national and cultural and religious rivalries between different European peoples, you can find in European history plenty of examples of Europeans aligning themselves with non-Europeans against other Europeans. I guess one of the most famous modern examples would be the supposed Aryan Germans aligning themselves with the not exactly Aryan Japanese against their fellow Aryans in Britain and France and America. So the idea that there's this kind of pan-racial solidarity among any of these peoples is obviously mythical. I think the primary reason that the native peoples in the Western Hemisphere were eventually conquered to the degree that they were was largely just due to technological superiority and a higher level of economic development in certain ways. I mean, the Europeans just happened to be the ones that had the biggest guns ultimately.
Yeah. I think now I'm generally a fan of Patrick J. Buchanan, but in his 1999 book, A Republic Not an Empire, he talks about he believes that manifest destiny and continental expansion were distinct and different from the later global ambitions of 20th century America. I think that that's not true. I think that manifest destiny necessarily, once the continent was tamed, necessarily led to future conquests like Cuba and the Philippines, and then later to the U.S. intervention in World War I and World War II, and then finally the Cold War, where the United States replaced the European empires.
Yeah, Buchanan is interesting because on one hand, he, unlike most people that have any kind of establishment background, he's not as willing to apologize for the more overt forms of modern American imperialism that have taken place. But he at the same time he does have a selective reading of history in that sense. I tend to argue, as we were saying earlier in the program, that America was imperialist at least right from the time of the founding, the American Revolution, and the creation of a new nation, and that the guiding forces behind that were capitalism, religion in some instances, Enlightenment philosophy and others, the classical liberalism and others, the idea of an empire of liberty. Racism enters into it, the idea that the Native Americans are a savage, barbarian people. They're not fit to govern themselves. And I think that the westward expansion into Native American territory was really the first beginning of American imperialism. And you see American imperialism subsequently taking root in efforts to crush the Southern independence movement, which happened, the Mexican War, as you were saying, the later invasions of Cuba and some of the Central American territories, the Puerto Rico, the Spanish-American War, all of that, the Philippine War, the annexation of Hawaii, all of the countless numbers of American interventions and invasions of Latin America during the early 20th century, gunboat diplomacy, as they used to call it. I would argue that America's always been an imperialist country, and it's always been motivated by largely the same basic set of objectives and factors, and the rationalization behind it might change over time. In the 19th century, for example, they didn't go to war over feminism or something like that. But when someone like Hillary Clinton or someone like that talks about going to war with Middle Eastern countries to liberate their women or something of that nature, I mean, it's really no different than President McKinley saying we're going to invade the Philippines to make them all into good Christians or something like that. It's always the idea that we're doing this for their own good. We're trying to help these folks. But it's always got this kind of moralistic rationalization behind it.
Yeah. The Spanish War is particularly interesting because the whole incident of the Maine was such a farce. modern accounts basically attributed to a boiler failure, but they blamed it on the Spanish, and that led to the war with Spain. And the real kicker is this: in the official U.S. diplomatic records, which I've read this particular part, Spain was willing to give in to every demand of the United States, a plebiscite, the whole 9 yards. But before our diplomat got back, we declared war. So it was clearly a pretext. Spain had already given in to every consideration.
Yeah, well, one of my favorite essays about that war is the one by William Graham Sumner, The Conquest of the United States by Spain. And what he argues is that war, to a large degree, really marked a transition between the United States ostensibly being a republic into being an imperial empire. I mean, I'd argue it really was before as well, but that's really the time that war is considered the sort of a turning point, in the sense where this is really when the United States starts to develop an expansionist, an openly expansionist ethos, foreign policy ethos, if you will. It's this pretense of being neutral and being a neutral, Swiss-like republic or something like that really starts to fall by the wayside at that point. And then, of course, just a short time later, 15 years later, 20 years later, you get the American entry into World War II. With the World War
I think you mean World War One.
World War One, yeah. World War One, the war to end all wars, to make the world safe for democracy and all of that. I mean, just that's really when I think the Jacobin model of thinking really started to take over American foreign policy for good, in its totality.
Yeah, this could be a whole podcast by itself, but the U.S. entry into World War One was, again, largely for mercenary reasons. Smedley Butler wrote that it was all about the money. We had bankrolled the Allies to such a degree that they were losing, and if they lost, they wouldn't pay us back. And we began to realize, well, by bankrolling France and Britain to such a degree that we had, we better go to war to save their fat from the fire, because if we don't, we won't get paid back.
Yeah, I think a powerful argument can be made for that the Americans had loaned a lot of money to the Allied nations in order to bankroll their war effort, and it wasn't going well for the Allies. I mean, the destruction of Germany in World War One was really one of the most tragic things that happened in history. I mean, given the fallout that came out of that. I mean, given the destruction of Germany, the Treaty of Versailles, and of course, we know everything that came after that. Woodrow Wilson, of course, the Wilson administration's propaganda said that this was a war to end all wars. This is a war to make the world safe for democracy. They depicted the war at the time as a great noble crusade against Prussian militarism. They presented the Prussians as the Huns. They were these backward. The Germans, they presented the Germans as these backward, reactionary militarists who hadn't caught up with the modern world. I mean, if anything, German culture and civilization during that time was at least as advanced as what you found in Western Europe and the United States.
Maybe even more so.
Yeah, certainly in terms of its intellectual culture, probably its scientific achievements. It was less liberal in a political sense, but it was the war was depicted as a war between Prussian Hun militarism on one hand and enlightened Western liberal democracy on another hand, that's certainly how the war effort was sold. In fact, Georges Clemenceau, who was the premier of or I forgot, was he the prime minister? He was either the prime minister or the foreign minister of France at the time.
I think he was the prime minister.
Yeah, he was talking about Clemenceau. There's a famous quote from Clemenceau where he talks about having dealing with Woodrow Wilson during the course of the war and the post-war ramifications as well. And he said that Wilson was by far the most self-righteous man that he had ever met. He said that he said I've met a lot of self-righteous men in my time, but this is the first guy that I ever met that thought he was a reincarnation of Christ or something. And I think that that's kind of the attitude that the Americans took towards that particular war. It's really sort of on one hand, I think American elites looked at it like it was the opportunity for the Americans to really claim their place on the world stage as a world power. And they were obviously, as you mentioned, there were some financial, economic issues involved, and there were also some very powerful ideological forces involved in that as well. But ironically, though, the Wilson administration domestically was a very illiberal, authoritarian administration. They crushed the labor movement. They deported a lot of radicals. They round up and arrested German ethnics, just because of their ethnic background.
And Wilson even favorably reviewed Birth of a Nation.
Yeah, that Birth of a Nation, which for listeners who don't know what that was, that's an early silent film. That's one of the early silent movies, but it's actually a documentary. Well, it's not a documentary. It's a fictional film, but it's about the Ku Klux Klan and the Ku Klux Klan during Reconstruction in the South, and it portrays the Ku Klux Klan in a very sympathetic light. But it was actually shown in the White House when Wilson was president. Phil and Wilson also instituted very rigid racial boundaries in the civil service system. During that time period, racism actually escalated quite a bit in the United States. It was really during that time period that Jim Crow and things like that really started to be put into practice. Some of the racial liberalization that came after the end of World War. After the end of the Civil War with Reconstruction and all of that kind of stuff had long since passed, and that had really rigidly defined racial boundaries had started to be implemented, particularly in the South. But it was in the federal government and really everywhere at that point.
Yeah. Not to get too far afield, but the peace treaty at Versailles was really kind of a watershed, because in previous European history, going back to the Treaty of Westphalia, a kind of spirit of compromise was the name of the game. At Westphalia, and then later at Vienna in 1815 with Napoleon, there was a general idea that we need to keep the peace. We need to not offend anybody too much, and that we'll have this kind of spirit of compromise. By World War I, that was all gone, and I don't really know why that disappeared, because Britain historically, especially during Napoleonic Wars, supported a policy of compromise. Russia wanted revenge, obviously, against Napoleon in France, but Britain said no, we're gonna have a policy of compromise. Another thing is, to backtrack just a little bit, I don't know what you think about this yourself, Keith, but there's a kind of interpretation of U.S. history and U.S. imperialism, which goes back to the Freemasons. And it argues that people like Roger Bacon, or Francis Bacon, and others who were inspired by Freemasonic ideas of a secular, humanistic, scientific republic, set down roots in America. And in fact, in 1910, there was a stamp released in Newfoundland about Bacon, and it said that Bacon was the mind behind the colonialization scheme, and that's another possible root of U.S. imperialism. So, what are your thoughts on those issues?
Well, I don't know that we really need to take it that far in terms of trying to identify the roots of U.S. imperialism, and you had radical sects that came out of the Enlightenment that had over the top ideas about a lot of things. But I think, though, that the advent of American imperialism is certainly explainable merely in the context of the convergence of some of the forces I mentioned earlier. Capitalism, the quest for resources, for material development, the utopian interpretation of Christianity that you find among New England Puritans, the Enlightenment idea of progress, the classical liberal idea of an empire of liberty. All of these ideas converge to really make American imperialism what it is. As far as the role of other secret societies and things like that, I tend to shy away from those kinds of interpretations of history, because I think that they are really sort of a distraction from what from things that are more readily identifiable, I think, as main currents within history. And as far as what you're saying about Germany, about after World War I, and the punitiveness of the Treaty of Versailles, about how it was really just about trying to grind Germany down to nothing. I think a lot of that can be explained in the same way. I think that really was this view of the Germans as these backward barbarian Huns, these Prussian militarists who hadn't caught up with the Enlightenment. They hadn't caught up with Western liberalism, and that's, I think, part of the reason why they were so adamant about getting rid of the monarchy, about getting rid of Kaiser Wilhelm and the monarchist tradition in general. I think it was really they viewed at Versailles, I think they really viewed themselves as overthrowing the remnants of a backward European relic. They viewed this as really the equivalent of getting rid of King Louis XVI. And even in American thinking today, you see that kind of thing. I know during the build up to the war in Iraq, when some of the European nations started expressing reservations about that, Donald Rumsfeld and people like that were saying, well, they're just the old Europeans. The Dick Cheney, Don Rumsfeld was saying, oh, that's old Europe. They're all backward, reactionaries. They're not with us on our crusade to bring enlightenment to Iraq or whatever. There may have been a lot of cynicism behind that, but that's just kind of the rhetorical stance they took. But I do think, though, that there's certainly a strand among Western elites that take these kinds of ideas seriously. It's all about this perpetual idea of progress.
Yeah. Again, the next subject could be a whole podcast in itself as well. But the U.S. entry into World War II, I find that to be equally mercenary because if you look at Great Britain, which was beginning in the late 1890s, Britain made a great shift in the 1890s. Britain tried to woo the Americans to their side, and it was largely successful and largely effective, as the two world wars would bear out. But the United States, it went to war in World War II, because Hitler declared war on the United States. But why Hitler declared war? Well, if you read Hitler's speech, he mentions the Chicago Tribune's leak of FDR's war plans to invade Europe, which were released in, I think, December 6th, the day before Pearl Harbor. And then 4 days later, December 11th, 5 days later, Hitler declared war on the United States. And of course, by that point, we had already bankrolled the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and China to an obscene degree. And if they were defeated, we wouldn't get paid.
Yeah, well, the events leading up to the U.S. entry into World War II were complicated as well. What you had there was a situation where Germany was obviously practicing a type of revanchism in a really extreme way. And I think that one thing that led to the war growing as rapidly as it did was the fact that the British and the French got a bit ahead of themselves. The British and the French started giving these guarantees to these Eastern European nations like Poland and so forth. And I think that the British really, keep in mind that it was the British and the French who declared war on Germany before Germany declared war on the British and the French. The Germans were actually involved in an Eastern expansion, not a Western expansion. And of course, there's the idea of Lebensraum. They needed living space for the Germans, the perfect Aryan race. There's this idea of the Anschluss and all of that, and reclaiming the territories that had been lost in at the Treaty of Versailles. But the Germans, or the Nazis, they actually viewed the Soviet Union as their primary enemy because they viewed Russians as, today a lot of white nationalists and others regard Russians as sort of an ideal, white, specimen or whatever. But that's not what the Nazis believed. They believed that the Russians were these Asiatic barbarian hordes. And the fact that they had fallen to Bolshevism, which they viewed as Jewish, was an even greater abomination in their view. So the Nazis were actually involved in an Eastern march, not a Western march, and their goal was to create a Nazi empire in Eastern Europe, which they succeeded in doing for a time, but they actually wanted to invade and annihilate the Soviet Union, which they viewed as their mortal enemy. That was the citadel of Jewish Bolshevism in their view. The Germans obviously had no love for the British and the French because of the outcome of World War I, and they were, of course, one of the things that brought them to power was their promise to avenge what happened at Versailles. There's the pictures you can find of Hitler doing sort of a dance, sort of skipping around happily after the French are defeated after the German invasion. But what led to the German invasion of France and occupation of France, and the attempted invasion of England, that Germany was turned back at the Battle of Britain, and they were never ever able to successfully occupy Britain. But what actually led to that was the Polish guarantee, was the fact that the British and the French told the Germans, if you try to annex Poland, we're going to go to war with you, and they did, and it turned out very poorly for the French. They were occupied after something like 6 weeks of fighting. Britain was very nearly occupied by Germany. Germany almost made it across the English Channel. They were turned back at the Battle of Britain. And it started to go downhill for the Germans after that. That was actually a turning point in the German war effort, where they, after they were defeated at the Battle of Britain, and then they were subsequently trying to fight a two-front war, one in the West and one in the East. But I think that war would have had a much different outcome if the British and the French and the Americans had played their cards a little bit better. A much more viable strategy would have been for the Western countries to simply allow the Germans to expand eastward and allow the Russians and the Germans to fight it out in Eastern Europe. And that would have had the impact of, certainly it would have had the impact of grinding down Germany in the way that it did, but it also would have had the effect of perhaps weakening the Soviet Union to an even greater degree than it did. And perhaps it would have spared the Western countries the kind of destruction that they experienced in the war with the occupations, with the German bombardment of Britain and so forth.
In many ways, 1950, or even no, actually the Berlin airlift was 1948. So 1948 was kind of Hitler's "I told you so." But I think one of the key things to get away from World War II and U.S. imperialism comes from J.F.C. Fuller's History of the Second World War, page 411. And he just finished describing of the development of the atomic bomb. And what can we call all this striving to destroy lead to? To a veritable religion of death, in which the scientist becomes the immolating high priest and humanity the sacrificial victim. And I think that's kind of a watershed where this kind of scientific cult of death takes over. And after World War II, the man in the white lab coat becomes our new priest, especially in America, and maybe secondarily in the Soviet Union. But these kind of immolating high priests that sacrifice mankind upon the altar of progress become the new priesthood and the new agents of universal imperialism.
Well, after World War II ended, you do see the rise of, well, it actually started before this. Like going back to the 1930s, you start to see this, and really even before that, you see the rise of this technocratic bureaucracy. And Max Weber wrote about this quite a bit. Max Weber talked about how modern efforts to apply scientific principles to social management had led to this kind of what he called an iron cage, which is this kind of all-encompassing bureaucracy that supposedly is trying to make society more rational and efficient, but it's really just sort of imprisoning people into this kind of cog in the machine. And you see that in Weber, you see that in some of the early critics of modernity. You see it in people like George Orwell and some of the people that influenced Orwell, and as well as some of the thinkers like Aldous Huxley, some of the anti-utopian writers of that type. But there is this idea that modernity has unleashed this thing where science is going to be the new the new tyrant, if you will. And you do see that in World War II with the kind of technological warfare that happened during that, of course, culminating in the atomic bomb and some things like that. And it's interesting how in the Cold War, particularly in the Cold War, I mean, one of the stereotypical images of the Cold War is the idea of, different, both sides have their scientists, in their lab coats working to develop the most powerful and deadly forms of weaponry you can think of. And all this is being done on scientific principles. That actually led, that and some other things actually led to some people developing a critique of the Enlightenment, of course, on the right and on the left. There on the right, obviously, there had always been critiques of the Enlightenment where they were saying, well, maybe we took this science thing a little too far. Isn't it possible that science can become a tyrant or, a dogmatic belief system in the same way religion can possibly become a dogmatic belief system that becomes tyrannical? Have we really just replace one thing with another? On the left as well, actually in the Frankfurt School, which to a lot of people on the right, any mention of the Frankfurt School is, it's akin to invoking the devil. But you got to take the good with the bad. If you actually get into some of the writings of some of the Frankfurt School thinkers, you find some of this. You find a critique of the Enlightenment and modern scientism as something that's become a force for repression. And of course, one of the things they were concerned about was what happened with the Holocaust. They were thinking, well, what was this but an effort to apply science and medicine to social management? And well, look what we got for it. That you do start seeing some of these kind of anti-utopian critiques that come out of that as well, like Brave New World in 1984. And I do think that it's interesting. You mentioned that the way that the scientific and medical professions start to become a new priesthood, if you will. One of my favorite writers who I think is widely ignored on this question, but I think a lot of people should pay more attention to him, is Dr. Thomas Szasz. Dr. Thomas Szasz was a maverick psychiatrist back in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. He died a few years ago. He was very old when he died, probably 97 or something like that. But Thomas Szasz wrote a lot back during the Cold War era. He wasn't particularly concerned about the Cold War itself as much as he was concerned with the way medicine had become a kind of new theocracy, if you will. He had this idea that psychiatrists in particular, he was a psychiatrist, and he was particularly concerned about the use of the mental health professions as a means of social control. And he used to talk about the use of psychiatry in places like the Soviet Union as a means of repressing political dissidents. He was actually, Thomas Szasz was Jewish, and he grew up in Hungary, and he left Hungary in 1938 prior to the Nazi incursion into Eastern Europe. And of course, after the war, he couldn't go back because it was under Stalinist occupation. So he was very critical, obviously, for obvious reasons, of totalitarian political systems, Nazism and communism and things like that. But he was, as a psychiatrist, he was particularly concerned with the way that psychiatry and medicine and science generally had been corrupted by these kinds of systems where, you would have psychiatrists or physicians or scientists who were essentially a white coat priesthood. They were these experts that were supposed to be able to proclaim, what knowledge to the peasants and so forth. And he saw a lot of excesses being associated with that.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of Tom Stafford. He also wrote a play about the man who was designated as insane by the Soviet government. It was kind of a black comedy where he says, trying to point out the absurdity of totalitarianism and labeling people as insane. But this is interesting, the Cold War. In many ways, it is an extension of US imperialism and US exceptionalism. Now, I know that, again, could be a podcast all in itself. But I think in some sense, the United States was the lesser of two evils in this war. I don't normally say that, and you probably know me well enough to know that I don't normally say that, but I do believe the United States was the lesser of two evils, and I prefer that they win and the Soviet Union won.
Yeah, well, I would argue certainly during the Cold War, the Western liberal democracies, including the United States, at least internally, were much better societies than the communist nations. But the you did have a higher level of economic development in those countries, in the Western countries, and a higher standard of living. You had more individual freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all of the usual things of that nature, rule of law, due process of law, things like that, things that, Western liberal traditions are best built on. The Soviet system really was a dungeon. I know people who grew up in that system and who talk about, how it really was, what it's depicted as being in 1984. But actually, there were some countries that were even worse than the Soviet Union. Even in Eastern Europe, I think the regime of Nicolae Ceausescu in particular was a really monstrous regime. I actually had a student once who had grown up in that particular system. She had some interesting stories to tell. But
Albania was pretty bad too.
Yeah. Albania. Well, yeah, Albania actually broke with the Soviet bloc and with the Warsaw Pact because they thought that they weren't extreme enough. They started giving their loyalty to Maoist China instead, the Hoxhaist. Yeah. And of course, a lot of Asian Stalinism was even worse than what you found in Europe. I mean, Maoism and Pol Potism and Kim Il Sungism.
Oh, definitely.
I mean, that's about as awful as it gets. But I think, though, that what's interesting about the Cold War and American imperialism is that I think that after World War II, the United States viewed itself as the rightful heir to the old colonial empires of Europe. The European nations were not able to maintain their colonial empires because all of those nations had been wiped out in the war. I mean, even to this day, the Western European nations are largely satellites of the United States, and that's all they've been since the end of World War II. I mean, the idea that the idea that those countries were once great empires seems bizarre to us now. We think Belgium was an empire. It seems ridiculous now, but that's what they were. But I think, though, that the United States viewed itself as the rightful heirs to the European empires and the territories in Africa and in Asia and in the Middle East. And I think the United States, of course, had always claimed the Western Hemisphere as its legitimate sphere of influence or rule or whatever. And I think, though, that the Americans, I actually think if it hadn't have been for the constraining force of the Soviet Union, the Americans would have even been more aggressive following during the Cold War period. If the Soviet Union hadn't have been there, I think that the Americans would have actually been more aggressive than they were. A lot of times, American imperialism during the Cold War is interpreted as saying, well, the Americans were merely reacting to Soviet expansionism and trying to prevent the spread of communism. And that was true. I mean, it's not that the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union certainly existed. The Soviet Union was certainly expansionist. It was a militarist nation. And the Americans certainly were not thrilled with the idea of the Soviets accumulating satellites throughout the underdeveloped world. So that's obviously true. But I still think, though, that even if the Soviet Union had never existed, the United States would be doing what it does today. It would be essentially trying to establish a global hegemony and eliminate regimes that oppose the interest of the American ruling class all over the world, as they're trying to do presently in places like Syria, for example. But as far as the question of the Soviet Union, the United States and the Western allied nations generally were certainly better societies than the Soviet system. There's no doubt about that. I mean, that was an awful system. And as I just said earlier, communism in Asia was arguably even worse. So it is interesting that you have the American imperialism, which was a very aggressive form of imperialism during the Cold War. Even if it had a better society, I think that ironically, I actually think the Americans were more aggressive in the Cold War than the Soviets were, and I say that not as a defense of the Soviet Union, as much as just the United States was in a better position to be aggressive. They just had more resources, more technology, more wealth, and things of that nature.
Well, let me interject real quick. In one sense, I think you're right. The United States being rich and powerful. This is a point that Hans Hoppe made. Hans Hoppe, in an interview, I forget when, I heard it years ago, but Hans Hoppe said the United States was rich, capitalistic, and powerful, and could afford to be aggressive militarily. But the Soviet Union was imperialistic in a kind of indirect way. It funded communist revolutions everywhere. In Cuba, China, Ethiopia, Chad, Angola, Mozambique, Nicaragua, and Vietnam. And in many ways, I don't think the United States would have been there if the Soviet Union, the classic example is Afghanistan. If the Soviet Union had not had a communist coup d'etat in Afghanistan, I don't think the United States would have given anything about Afghanistan. I think in a lot of ways, the Soviet Union had a kind of more underhanded imperialism, less visible, and hence less identifiable, but no less as aggressive and violent as the United States. But I think you are right in this respect, that without a countervailing superpower, the United States would have been more aggressive, and vice versa, the Soviet Union would have been more aggressive had there been no countervailing superpower. But in the decades since the collapse of the Soviet Union, which we're living in now, the United States has been invading or destabilizing Middle Eastern countries pretty much with impunity. And the disaster of Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and Libya are just pretty much for everyone to see. They're just utter, complete disasters. And I wonder if they're doing that on purpose, to just destabilize the region for maximum chaos.
Well, before I get to that, I want to clarify something about the Soviet Union. I would argue that the Soviet Union's imperialism was an awful form of imperialism. I would not make the argument that it was somehow more benign or a more ethical form of imperialism, if there can be such a thing, than American imperialism. I don't think that at all. Soviet imperialism was extremely brutal. If you look at what they did in Eastern Europe, for example, in response to even the slightest opposition to Soviet rule in those countries, if you look at what they did to Poland, to East Germany, to East Berlin, to Czechoslovakia, to Hungary, anytime there was even a slightest rebellion in those countries, they sent in tanks and they crushed that rebellion right away. They were extremely brutal. In societies where they sponsored insurgent movements, they encouraged those particular movements to behave in a very brutal way when they came to power. I mentioned Kim Il-sung earlier. When Kim Il-sung was strongly encouraged by his then allies, the Soviet Union, to create the kind of totalitarian personality cult that he created in North Korea.
You can also see him in Gitsu in Ethiopia too in the 80s.
Yeah, and the Soviet Union, as you were saying, I argue that they were less imperialistic than the United States only because their reach was shorter, not because their imperialism was a nicer form of imperialism.
Sure.
And the United States supported and backed and financed a lot of really awful people during the Cold War, ranging from the death squad regimes in Central America to the Indonesian invasion and occupation of East Timor, to even the American and the British were actually supporting Pol Pot in the 1980s. Which is
I know,
inconceivable on one hand, but it happened. But the Soviet Union was no better in terms of their approach to imperialism. They were extremely aggressive and brutal within their against their own satellites. They in Eastern Europe, they would back absolutely awful guerrilla insurgent movements around the world and encourage them to behave in awful ways. So the idea that they were somehow, benevolent or benign or something as imperialists is not at all an argument I would make. I'd argue their imperialism was not as extensive simply because they had a shorter reach, and that was all. Their arms weren't as long. As you were saying, what they would try to do was they would try to foment insurgencies around the world in some of these very poor countries, in the name of anti-imperialism and national liberation and things like that. They would try to hijack and get control of genuine anti-imperialist movements in the third world. The United States would do things like, bankroll military dictators and death squad regimes and things like that as well. So that's the kind of push-pull that existed during the Cold War. But turning the subject matter to post-Cold War American imperialism, yeah, some of that is almost bizarre in a way. It's very dystopian. People can go to my website, attackthesystem.com, and I do a lot of commentary for Press TV, which is an Iranian radio and television network. But I do a lot of commentary on foreign policy for them.
You anti-patriotic traitor, you.
Yeah, well, tell me something I say that's not true. I'm always willing to be persuaded. If I have my facts wrong, or if somebody doesn't agree with me and they have counter information, that's fine. But tell me what the facts are. That's all I'm interested in. I'm not interested in whose team wears the best colors or something like that. But one thing that I've always pointed out in my interviews with the Iranians is that American imperialism, particularly in the Middle East, in its present form, I think, as you said earlier, it really is just about creating chaos. I think that the evidence is clear that there's a pattern of the Americans simply trying to create chaos in the Middle East. And I think the main thing they object to is the establishment or maintenance of independent, stable governments in the Middle East that are opposed to American imperialism, that simply refuse to be incorporated into the system of American hegemony. I think that's the real issue they always had with Gaddafi, the entire 45 years or 43 years or whatever it was that he was in power. That's the real issue they had with Saddam Hussein. He was a former client who, got too big for his britches or whatever. That's the real issue they have with the Iranians. It was the Iranians that deposed the Shah, who was an American puppet for 26 years. That's the real issue they have with the Assad regime in Syria, which refuses to be incorporated into the American international system. I think that's and I think that they really would prefer to have chaos in the Middle East than have stable, independent countries that simply refuse to be incorporated into that American-dominated system. One thing that the Americans do is that they indirectly finance and promote some of these awful Islamist, Wahhabist-influenced terrorist organizations in the Middle East. One way that they do that is because nations like Saudi Arabia and some of the other really reactionary Gulf nations are such strong American allies. The effect of that is that those nations actually fund the mosques and the religious organizations that promote this kind of Islamic extremism. And because these countries are allied with the United States and funded by the United States actually supports this kind of thing, I think consciously, because I think they actually see that as less of a threat to the United States than something like a secular Arab nationalism or a more moderate Islam that's simply anti-imperialist or a leftist Arab anti-imperialism or Muslim anti-imperialism. I think that that's really what they're worried about. They don't want a revival of Nasserism. Colonel Nasser was a head of state in Egypt for a number of years, and he was in the 60s and 70s. I guess in the 50s and 60s. I guess he died around 1970, 69, something like that. But he was a pan-Arabist. He advocated unity among Arabs against Western imperialism, and he wanted to have independent, largely secular, or at least non-theocratic. He wasn't an Islamist per se. He was a secular Arab nationalist, and he wanted to have a secular Arab nationalist regimes throughout those parts of the world. And I think that Nasserism and other ideas that are comparable is really what the West has always feared the most. I think they find these really backward Wahhabist type of movements to be far more acceptable. I think what happens, though, is that what the Westerners have tried to do, particularly the Americans and the British, is that they've tried to sort of play different cards against each other or different ends against the middle. They will back these really reactionary Gulf states. They will indirectly and sometimes even directly, like in the Afghan war, support these Islamic fundamentalist terrorist organizations. And they do that in part, I think, to counter the influence of other forms of anti-imperialism in that region, but then it always blows up in their face. They're always trying to. What's happening in Libya right now is a good example. They were always opposed to the Gaddafi regime for these kinds of reasons, and then finally the Americans went to war in 2011 and got rid of Gaddafi. And what's happened now? Well, the Islamists have taken over Libya. ISIS has gotten a foothold in Libya. The same thing is happening in Syria. I think these so-called moderate rebels that the Americans are backing, John McCain's friends in Syria. I think they're trying to use these forces as a means of destabilizing the Assad regime, which in the long run is their long run goal is to overthrow Assad altogether. But if Assad is overthrown, what's going to happen? Well, the same thing's going to happen that's happened in the regions of Syria where Assad has lost power. It's going to be ISIS or something similar that actually takes over. And I think the Americans actually would prefer it that way. I think they prefer absolute chaos in the region because I think that makes it easier for them to dominate the petroleum trade. I also think the Israel lobby plays a big role in this. The Israel lobby has, maybe not the right wing of Israel's politics, the Likudniks, the Likud party, which is heavily aligned with the Israel lobby in the United States, and by extension, these neoconservative people. I think they've long had this idea of a greater Israel, an expanded, Zionist empire in the Middle East. I think they view the Americans as their partners in that. This idea of an American-Israeli co-prosperity sphere. And I think that they believe that just creating chaos in the region and destabilizing all of the local regimes, whether it's the Iraqis, whether it's the Syrians, whether it's the Lebanese, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's the Iranians, getting rid of all of that and just creating chaos instead is going to make that kind of expansionism more viable over the long run. That really seems to me to be the most plausible explanation for American foreign policy in the Middle East, because it certainly fits the pattern. There's this, if you start with this premise, you can see a very, very identifiable pattern that goes on over time.
I agree with pretty much everything you said about the Middle East, but I think we've gone pretty far over an hour, and I think it's time to wrap it up. So thanks for coming on, Keith. It's been a really interesting and enlightening conversation. Why don't you plug yourself before we wrap it up?
Yeah, if you want to find out more about me, if you don't know who I am, you can go to attackthesystem.com, just like it sounds, attack, A-T-T-A-C-K, the T-H-E, system, S-Y-S-T-E-M, attackthesystem.com. If you Google my name online, just on a regular Google search, you can find all kinds of things about me. You can find how much
he's a nasty fascist.
Yeah, you can find how many enemies I have. You can find interviews with me on YouTube. I've done a lot of commentary for Press TV. I've done commentary for Russia Today and some other outlets like that. But yeah, there's plenty of stuff about me online. You could spend a couple of days Googling my name and finding out, finding articles I've written. I've got several books out. I've got another book coming out sometime soon. I don't know how soon, probably this year. Yeah, there's a lot of material about me available.
Well, thanks for coming on, Keith Preston. I hope to have you on in the future. This is Todd Lewis for the Praise of Folly podcast, signing out.